So Rita, just a comment. Frank has asked the question of a concrete example of kind of early warnings model. The example that we've put out here is that there's some point in the future, call it March of next year, that you have two alternative futures and that you can prepare for. One of our favorite examples, which we've been talking about lately, is the petroleum industry, right? So I think that's a great example, Frank, of there's an industry where you're looking down a tunnel, there's a light, and you know the light's not the end of the tunnel, it's a train coming, right? And the world is gonna change. And if you are Exxon, and you've seen what happened with Exxon over the last several months with, now I think it's 3 dissident board members joining the board, or you're in the petrochemical business and you're using petrochemicals to make your product, the world's going to change. Pricing is going to change. The demand for your product is going to change. So it's a fascinating study, because if you look at, I think oil's around $70 a barrel today, which is a 2-year high. The short term is completely disconnected with the long term. The long term is very, very clear that something's going to happen. It's very clear if you have, billions or hundreds of billions, as ExxonMobil has or BP has, that you have to do something very serious to prepare for this change.
Yeah, I would just add that the way I normally set it up, Frank, is we'll have a time zero event. And in the book, it goes into some depth about how you can generate those, which is essentially you take 2 uncertainties that are real. This gives you a 2x2 of 4 possible futures. And then you write a headline from each future. That becomes your time zero event. And then what we recommend is work backward and say, before time zero could happen, what would have to be true? Right. So let's take our time zeros that we're playing around with today. So March of 2022, no problem. What would have to be true? Right. We'd have to see increasing evidence that people are vaccinated or have somehow achieved some kind of immunity. We'd have to see that there aren't variants that are increasingly contagious. We'd have to see that good regimes in terms of keeping people safe continue to be adopted. We'd have to see, for example, that children are starting to be protected, and right. For that to be true, there's a lot that would have to happen before we believe in that scenario. And the same with the other scenario. In the other scenario, unfortunately, what you'll see is more deadly variants. You'd see people who are unable to or unwilling to, or just can't get vaccinated for whatever reason, continue to be a large proportion of the population. You'll sort of see localized outbreaks, especially among more vulnerable populations. And the thing about global health is, if any of us are affected, all of us are at risk of being affected. So I think that's just really important to remember. So the worked model would be you have your time zero, and then you work backward looking for indicators. And then a best practice, what we advise our clients is, then you set up a little, almost call it a council within your organization, where everybody has a job. Everybody's looking after an indicator. So let's say Flaminia is looking after the indicator of, per local region, how many people, what percentage of the people are actually vaccinated. And she would track that, right? And now if Ron or I or you come across something that is evidence around that, now we know who to send it to, right? So we send it to Flaminia. Then we have our little meeting, maybe once every month, once every 2 months. And the purpose of the meeting is not to make decisions. The purpose of the meeting is to make sense of what's going on. So a very similar process to the one that Stan McChrystal used in his fabulous book, Team of Teams, when he was trying to mount a response by a very hierarchical organization, the US military, to an enemy that was changing its shape on the ground all the time. And what he found was they needed to create what he calls shared consciousness. And the same is true with these kinds of early warnings. It's not that the data aren't there. The data are always there. It's just they're locked in individual brains. They're spread out somewhere where we're not seeing them. So we're not seeing the strategic implications.
So Frank just asked a follow-up, and this is Rita's sweet spot, so I'll comment, then I'll turn it over to Rita. He's asking if Exxon and BP will have less freedoms the longer they wait to make changes. And the answer to that is absolutely, unequivocally, that is true. So if you think about their business, they pour concrete, they build or lease these massive ships that are as big as small towns. These are assets that have 20, 30, 40-year life cycles. So they're spending capital today that they will be depleting over the next 20 to 30 years. So every decision they make today to influence the future locks them into some kind of economic outcome. Another fascinating area for me, and it's one of the things that I discuss when I'm coaching CEOs and board members, is this kind of asymmetry between a CEO lifespan or board lifespans, compensation, and the future. So if you think about some of these industries, and it's one of my favorite topics, like I'm the CEO of big petroleum company, global petroleum company A, and I'm going to retire in 5 years. How do I think about radical change in my organization? And how do I think about preparing my organization for an event that is certain to happen in 20 or 30 or 40 years? And the certainty is you won't be selling gasoline to automobiles. So your demand will be down very, very significantly. When my compensation is tied to now in the next 5 years. It's a huge cultural problem. It's a big issue for boards. Even board members can think the same way. I'm on the board. I'm going to be here 3 years. Is all I have to do is not do anything that gets me sued when I leave, and I'll collect my my stock compensation. So the cultural aspect of these kind of transformations and the personal kind of motivations can be very disconnected from a really obvious future state. Rita and I are working with a petrochemical company now, and I'll let Rita tell the story about this engagement, but it's very, very typical of how some organizations operate. Rita, do you want to talk about?
Oh, sure. So toward the end of, it would have been 2020, sort of fall of 2020, I get this frantic call. We really, really, really want to work with you. You've got to come talk to our board. We want to transform. We want to change. We want to do all this. And it was all like, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. Let's get the contract in place. Let's get this moving. So then frantic pace of meetings, like, hours of meetings every week, getting ready for this board, lots of research. Here's what we want to do. Meeting with the strategy committee, meeting with the board advisors, meeting. I mean, they were like my whole calendar for about 3 months there. And so the big board meeting happens. Let's say it was January, and we're all ready, right? Like, okay, we got the go ahead, the green light. The board loved it. It was really mind blowing, and they loved the way we talked about their stock price. We loved the way they talked about their future communication strategy. This is all great. And so we're getting into January, and well, there's a lot of work to do to follow up on the board. Okay, so now it gets to be kind of February, and they're kind of looking around and quarter's looking a little soft, and we've got this digital transformation thing that we're also trying to worry about. And I'm like, look, I'm here, let me know. And so there's like 2 guys that I'm working with pretty closely and giving ideas and, doing various activities. But the main attention of the leadership seems to have moved on. So February turns to March turns to April. And then I get this sort of sheepish call saying, well, we're not sure that we can really act on the things that we talked about because there's all this other stuff going on. So we're going to put it on pause. I'm thinking to myself, it's fine with me. Like, it's your company, but all that progress we made, you just know is going to erode, right? So the enthusiasm, the energy, the momentum is going to erode, and then we're going to have to start it up again. And it's going to be back to, back-to-back crisis meetings when the next thing happens. And what's going to happen, I suspect, is the board's going to start to ask pretty pointed questions about, you were talking this great game in January. What show us where it is. And this is actually something Ron and I are working on a lot, which is how do we create consistency across the management of a portfolio? And it is one of the perennial frustrations when you go into a large, complicated company and you say to them something very innocuous, like, so what are you guys working on? Once you dig into that question, what becomes pretty clear is nobody knows. And so one of the things we've been building, and I've been doing it manually for years, we're working on this tool to kind of make it a little easier to figure out what's where at what stage, but more importantly, to capture information about it as it's developing. So you don't get this mythology about what actually happened in the company. And you've got some idea about who's working on what and to what end. And it's not to try to impose layers of control. goal is just to create a reality around what is it that we've actually learned, what is it we're actually doing, and we're excited about it. I think it could be a bit of a breakthrough, so I'm keen on it. Was that sort of what you had in mind, Ron, for me to talk about?
Yeah, it absolutely was. There's now a question here. It's like, can you apply this framework to product development and early stage entrepreneurship? And I think the answer is absolutely. I'm going to talk about product development, Rita, and I'll let you talk about entrepreneurship. And what I'll talk about in product development is I actually just posted this morning the story of Minidisc and Sony, and how that.
You should probably tell them a little bit about yourself now that I'm thinking.
Oh yeah,
because I don't think I did a very good job introducing you.
Well, thank you, Rita. I grew up at Sony, so I spent probably about half of my career at Sony, in various roles. But ultimately,
well, you were there when it really grew, right? I mean, you were there.
I was there, yeah. When I joined Sony, it was about $1 billion company. When I left, it was about a $30 billion company, which was a fantastic ride. It's still many of my closest friends are still Sony people in the Sony world. So it was a great ride, and I got to do a lot of things that if a company wasn't growing that fast, I probably wouldn't have got to do. And one of them was run the personal mobile products company. So back in the day, that was the Walkman company. And Minidisc was one of the products. And if you go to my LinkedIn, you'll see a little story on Minidisc and kind of what happened there. But the question is, can you apply this framework to product development? So beyond Sony, I then went out into retail. I was at Best Buy during one of their transformations, which is really exciting. And I've also done a lot of work in private equity with a number of transformations in private equity, and some very successful and some not so successful, because that's how the world goes. I want to talk about, from a product development standpoint, there are a couple of really interesting ways to think about this. So when I first got into product on the Sony side, the compact disc was still a really big thing, right? And it was going to be eventually replaced by pure digital audio. And it was very, very clear to the music industry, it was very, very clear to Sony that this was going to happen. But the question becomes, how do you prepare for that? And how do you truly think through that? The Minidisc article touches on some of these things. So those of you who are older than Flaminia, God bless you, Flaminia, probably never owned a CD player, understand
I never did.
the digitization of audio was a terrifying thing for the music industry, because it meant you could now, once it's ones and zeros, it's quite easy to photocopy a CD. So the industry spent a lot of time trying to constrain the free movement of music, while the electronics industry wanted to sell devices that could, copy and replicate music. And it was very, very clear to see that there was a point at which where broadband was going to get fast enough, the internet was going to get fast enough, that truly downloading and streaming music was going to happen. But it wasn't clear as to when that point was or what the business model was. Throughout the 90s, there was a huge number of failed attempts to control music. One was called the Secure Digital Music Initiative. If you ever want to have your head explode, go to Wikipedia and read about that one. I lived through that for about 5 years, which essentially was an industry trying to put a digital wrapper around everything in the world. And of course, that never worked. And ultimately, the people who solved this problem were not in the music industry, and were, in fact, not in the portable music device industry. And it was a little fruit company called Apple that came up with this thing called an iPod and Apple Music. And they were able to do it because they, from my perspective, they were free of the constraints of thought and free of the constraints of the conflicts within the music and electronics industry. Think about Sony. Sony actually owned both pieces. They owned the biggest record company in the world and the biggest electronics company in the world, and we could not talk to each other. I actually proposed a product called Music Station in Japan, which almost got me fired, that said we can combine these things and make digital recordings and sell them. And I proposed that in 1999. And you guys know that the iPod wasn't even introduced until 4 or 5 years later. So we were ahead, but we couldn't execute because we culturally could not get out of our own way. And frankly, the idea was probably a little bit too early. But you absolutely, unequivocally, it was obvious to everyone in the industry that this was coming. What was not obvious was, and was not really well thought out, in my opinion, was all the optionality. And Rita can talk about platforms and stepping stones as something that she's written a lot about, that those platforms and stepping stones were not developed and were not worked. And therefore, somebody on the outside just did it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's an amazing story. I remember there was an article that came out, and I want to say it was as long ago as 1984. And it was the title of the article was "The Civil War Inside Sony." And yep. The article made the point that, you had the hardware people and they wanted all the content to be free. You had the content people and they wanted the hardware to be free, and then you sort of had the distribution people who didn't care what happened as long as they got their act together and you had something to sell, and nobody talked to each other. So absolutely difficult. So let's talk a little bit about entrepreneurship, because I think, yes, you can definitely apply this model to entrepreneurship with true entrepreneurship. What I mean by that is when you're creating a new category. So I'm not talking about opening up like a franchise dry cleaning business, which is also entrepreneurship. I'm not denigrating it, but I'm saying if you're truly creating a new kind of category. And the case I'll use here is the case of Jim McKelvey, who's been a Fireside guest, and he was one of the co-founders of the product that later became Square. And basically it's, making a phone a credit card. And the reason he thought about this product, and it was not his first business, he's actually a glass blower. He's a very highly skilled and highly trained glass blower. And he was in the process of packing up his studio in one part of the country to move it to another. And there was this huge, really ugly piece of glass that he didn't know what to do. He didn't really like it. And he finally found a buyer for it. And he was just thrilled. But it turns out this buyer, was a woman who wanted to pay for this thing on her American Express card. And he couldn't accept American Express cards. He was a very small business at the time. And, tiny little businesses can't afford interchange fees. They can't afford the overhead of what it takes to be accredited as a vendor. And Amex is expensive. I mean, for years, many people didn't carry them because they were so expensive to wear. So he lost the sale. And this sparked in him a passion to figure out, why couldn't we make a credit card product that would work for people like him, that would work for small vendors. And he's got a wonderful book called The Innovation Stack, which I can highly recommend to any of you that are interested in innovation. I can also recommend watching our Fireside Chat, which you'll find on YouTube. He's just tells the story in a wonderful way. But what he talks about is that any existing regime bumps up against a wall. And if you think about it as venturing out into unknown territory, there comes a point where what's known comes to an end. And it comes to an end, I would argue, this is my language, not his, but it comes to an end because there's some breakthrough, there's some barrier, there's some inflection point that has not yet happened. And what these true entrepreneurs do is they really think about, what would it take to break through that? Like, what is the inflection point I would have to create or leverage to break through that? And McKelvey talks about all the things they had to do to turn the phone into a credit card. And there's a whole chapter on how you get regulated as a credit card provider. And then there's the technology, right? Because those of you that know the Square reader, it's a tiny little square that you plug into the part of your phone that used to have the headphones in it, which doesn't anymore. And I guess now they plug it into wherever the charging thing is. But, they had to make this really thin, really attractive looking device. They had to solve all these problems. And so what I think how the model applies in entrepreneurship is, you've got your time zero, which is this thing's in everybody's hands. And my brother who does plumbing can accept credit card payments. That's the vision. That's the time zero. But what we have to do is break through all these barriers to do it. And in the book, McKelvey talks about how Amazon literally tried to take them out. They had I think it was called Neighborhood, something like that. I forget what the Amazon reader was, but he said he would go to bed at night like sweating bullets because, my God, one of the best financed, most aggressive, best run companies on the planet is coming after your little startup. And he said, we talked about it, we spoke about it, we went back and forth as a leadership team, trying to figure out what are we going to do. And then we decided to do absolutely nothing differently, because we had solved all these problems that Amazon didn't even know existed yet. And eventually, after about, I think it took about a year, but after about a year, Amazon folded. They've just said, we can't compete with this startup that's so laser focused on solving this series of problems. And in what I thought was quite a nice gesture to the customers, when Amazon decided to pull out of this business, they bought Square readers for all of their customers, sent the Square readers in a beautiful little box with a note saying, we think you'll be better serviced by working with Square. And, fascinating story. But again, you've solved these problems in ways that are not copyable by somebody who hasn't had that experience. And so that's how I would relate it to this sort of category creating flavor of entrepreneurship.